In this episode, I am speaking with Sophie Wade, who is the author of Empathy Works, the key to competitive advantage in the new era of work. We're going to talk about the newest generation in the workplace, Generation Z, and how we need to adapt to them. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 295 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I'm speaking with Sophie Wade, who is the author of Empathy Works, the key to competitive advantage in the new era of work. We're going to talk about the newest generation in the workplace, Generation Z, and how we need to adapt to them. This is a timely subject as people are returning to the office, at least part-time, and Generation Z entered the workforce during the pandemic. I am all for the multigenerational workforce, but the Generation Z are starting their careers out in very uncertain times. We will discuss many aspects of how to work with and manage your Generation Z colleagues and employees. Let me read a bit from her bio from her website, sophiewade.com. Sophie Wade is a speaker, author, authority of future of work issues. Her book, Embracing Progress, Next Steps for the Future of Work, is an executive MBA textbook and required reading for several management school leadership courses. Sophie is the founder and workforce innovation specialist at FlexCell Network, a future of work consultancy. Sophie's executive advisory work and transformative workshops help companies future-proof their work environments and attract, engage, and retain their multi-generational and distributed talent. She helps corporations maximize the benefits and minimize the disruption in their transition to talent-focused new work environments. Sophie has held senior management, strategy, and finance roles around the world, in Asia, Europe, and the U.S., working in media, technology, and venture capital for companies such as IMG and Yahoo. With a strategy and finance focus for her first career, she assisted entrepreneurs and major corporations identify, develop, and execute strategic initiatives, build teams and ventures, and create partnerships. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else figure out what they want to do in the second half of life and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they did not know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learn from each other and broaden their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what Charles had to say about being part of the community.
Well, when I joined the community, I had experienced a lot of success in my career as a health researcher, but I had a calling that I should apply those skills in another way. And I didn't know how to do that. And I felt really uncomfortable with that feeling of uncertainty of where I should be going next. So through the community, I learned a lot of skills on how to advance and grow my knowledge in a way that allowed me to transition from a really technical area of health research to health policy. Through that process, I established a new network of colleagues to get me there. And it's allowed me now to work in an area that I again find I've got my mission back, and I'm excited to get up in the morning to go in and do something important.
I'm recruiting new members. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, on to my discussion with Sophie Wade. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having Sophie Wade, the author of Empathy Works, the key to competitive advantage of the new era of work. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
The topic we're going to talk about today is dealing with Gen Z. And many...
The way you say that, it's already there.
Well, as I said before we got on the call today, I used to do a multi-generational workshop, and I only went down to Gen Y because Gen Z really hadn't entered the workplace or had just started. Now they're in the workplace, and I have people who are returning to work who have to go, oh. So let's start out with, what is Generation Z?
The Generation Z, well, it's typically around 1995 to 2015. So they are, you don't have so many of them in the workplace now, but they do seem to be influencing quite a lot. And, they are, as well as millennials, disproportionately. In fact, millennials are the people most represented in the Great Resignation, but Gen Z are as well. And Gen Z have more than any generation. They're disproportionately anxious, depressed, have a lot of these issues, and we can certainly, look at their reality because it's very, very different to the realities that I had. I'm a Gen Xer, but that's one of the key things in terms of understanding. Because actually, the way I'm very interested that you had your multi-generational workshop, because the way I sort of started, I never intended to be, to do so much about Gen Z or millennials, but it really was, there was so much lamenting about, oh God, these millennials. And so I sat down and I really looked at all the research and started really trying to put myself in their shoes, because in so many ways they weren't any particularly different, as Gen Z aren't particularly different from any young generation coming into the workforce, young folks coming into the workforce. But there are a number of issues. There are a number of differences, as you were saying, before we started this, in terms of technology, in terms of how they're using technology and the sort of digital intuitiveness, and also the security of their situation, the foundation of their environment, how they think about the planet, or the state of the planet, or the concerns about the potential state of the planet. There are a lot of fundamental causes for unease, which I think we really need to recognize how they actually feel about that. I think that's a sort of fundamental starting point for understanding Gen Z.
I claim that most of us baby boomers, we were shaped by Watergate and the Vietnam War. In other words, we didn't trust government worth at all.
Oh, that's fascinating. Because I'm English, so I wouldn't have. I obviously know what those incidents are, but obviously those didn't shape me in later years. That's really interesting.
And so, and Gen Xers, really, you grew up in a relatively peaceful time. So, what are the events or the conditions that is shaping Gen Z?
So certainly, I think some of them we don't yet know, because obviously the generation isn't fully out yet. But we know that for example, the Great Recession of 2008 shaped millennials very much and what they saw going on. As a basis for that, I would say that the pandemic and the potential reaction of certainly Gen Z were watching what was happening and how companies reacted to the pandemic and how they fired people or didn't, and how people, as we go into this recession, if we go into a recession, how companies react. There are already articles sort of saying, well, you can see, they thought they had it good, but now we'll see when it goes into the recession. I'm sort of saying, be careful, because if how you react will have a very long tail to it, because people are paying attention. So I think that not necessarily so much the actual pandemic, obviously that affected us all in very different ways, because the anxiety and the depression and those issues were there before, and the climate change was there before. But I think those may have been elevated or exacerbated in terms of now it's kind of like get back to work or come back to the office and you have to do things. And it's like, well, hang on a second. There are all these issues and I thought we all really cared about each other. We were being more empathetic, but there is research that I was just seeing that show that apparently we're being less empathetic. We're being less caring than we were before, which is a problem.
I'm fortunate. I have a son who graduated in 2006 and got his first job in 2007, pre the Great Recession.
Oh,
so
right.
He worked all the way through. He now buys weapon systems for the Navy.
But didn't he see? I mean, because what I understand is that they were watching their parents, obviously not you, their parents getting fired and their parents' friends getting fired, no matter how long those careers were. And that was really the fundamental basis for not a lack of loyalty, but a lack of an understanding that the corporations have no loyalty to me. And therefore, if I'm going to try and have any income security, any future security, I need to be really thinking about, me.
Well, actually, that started with your generation.
Okay.
Because I worked for IBM in the early 90s when IBM discontinued the full employment. But I was fortunate. My son got hired. He stayed employed. Many of his friends didn't really start their careers for 6-7 years. And I can't imagine being in college or high school during the pandemic.
Yes, my son's first year, he's actually studying in Milan, was challenging. I think it wasn't as bad as some of the universities here in the States because they completely shut people down. Had he had a sort of dorm from the university at Bocconi, that would have been, they were actually really the same, locked in their room, but he had a place off campus with two guys. So that was actually two other guys. So that was actually sort of better. And Milan had been through such a bad time that it was sort of okay, okay. But I think for certainly talking to friends of mine with the experiences that they had, my daughter had 1 week on, 1 week off. I mean, I think the experiences, the challenges, particularly in the public school system here in the US, that challenge with education, which has not been invested in sufficiently, as far as the way I look at it, that's going to have a long-lasting effect for sure. Because that was the first year certainly was a disaster in many places.
Here I am. I've gone back to work, and I've got to deal with some very young employees who are Gen Z. They're new hires. In general, because one of the things I warn people, don't generalize. These are not monolithic groups, right?
For sure.
They all behave the same, because they don't. But what are some of the general rules that I can expect them to be different, or how should I treat them, or how should I behave differently?
I think understanding the new reality as it looks for everybody, and then them. So first of all, the future of work has arrived, as it was accelerated and arrived by the pandemic and all the new technologies that we're implementing. So 2020, it arrived. And that has really changed the nature of work and how we're having to work. We're having to work more closely together. I know that you understand this very well, but it is meaning that we're having to work much more closely together. We're having we're dealing with nonlinear static. We're having to work it out as we go along and pivot and all these, interesting things as far as I'm concerned. But there was an interesting Wall Street Journal article that came out in April 2019, which was talking about the graduating class of 2019. And it said that the way that the sort of the really boring jobs, the repeatable jobs at that time, we have already been automated away. Therefore, leaving that the entry-level jobs that the new sort of graduates were going to be coming into, which are going to be 3 to 4 years more sophisticated and more complicated than previous generations. So put that together with the fact that you have a generation a group of young people who are worried about the planet, who are worried about their futures. They are as aware, even more aware, that there is no retirement. Their pension funds are underwater, and they understand sort of almost more intuitively than anybody else that they have not only no income security, but they understand that companies don't know that, we all know that we're trying to work it out as we move forward. So when companies are having to pivot and they can't be giving any guarantees, and it's whether they understand exactly, why, and the level of uncertainty that we're living with, that's a very tough place for young people to be coming into an organization. So one of the things that happens is that they're worried about asking questions. They're worried about looking stupid, and they will often, go and Google it. They won't ask a question. They'll go and Google it, which actually makes a lot of sense. And they'll come up with some reasonable, I interviewed for my book, I interviewed a young man who was 25 or something. And he was, supervising some interns and some people younger than him. And he said, I know that they go and Google it. So what he does is he try and, ask the questions that he thinks they're going to ask. He, creates that safe space so that they can ask questions and not feel stupid, and know that they aren't going to get fired if they ask questions, because it isn't a natural thing for them to be doing. But when they have this insecurity and they're coming into a workplace, which their boss isn't necessarily aware of how much more complicated it is, it's just sort of evolved that way, and that we don't know exactly where we're going, that's a pretty worrying place for someone to be in when there's a disparity of or sort of discrepancy in terms of how each person is actually interpreting the environment. I think understanding where the young folks are coming from and being really thoughtful about what they're expecting, what they do and they don't know, and what we do and don't know. The people above them who we don't have all the answers. And that's okay. And I think being transparent about it is really important, because we can't pretend to have all the answers, and also encouraging and bringing them along with us and asking them is going to be helpful, because that's also how we've been teaching them and raising them as kids. So
this brings up an interesting point in my head around onboarding these young people into remote work environments. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was on several HR webinars where they were going, yeah, we've experienced how to hire remotely. We are clueless how to onboard remotely. And I know that early on, there was a number of concerns about younger people just going, how can they understand the corporate culture, the office environment, if all they are is remote? Do you have some thoughts about that?
But when it comes to onboarding, yes, there are many companies who are one piece of what they're doing that is in the office is onboarding at the beginning, and that is part of what's in the office, and sort of then over time there will be moments where they're really very intentional about using office time, not only to help them have the confidence to ask their manager questions, but also it's very, very important in terms of them being able to have visibility and connection with more senior people, because that's part of the sort of the purpose of where they're coming. They want to have meaning. They want to know where they're going. They want to see a career progression and kind of like the visibility for themselves, if they were to stay in this company, or what this company is really doing and who's doing it, and what so really those kind of connections. Now, it doesn't have to be in person, and there are certainly companies who are completely remote or doing onboarding because they're bringing on people who are. I was just interviewing the CEO of a financial services company in the UK, and he has many people who are, they generally are completely remote. But at the same time, it has to be very intentional if those people are going to always be remote. So making sure, certainly in those early days that there is a lot of communication, a lot of discussion about culture, what that means, really articulating what the culture is, and then living it and having all the senior people and all the managers who they're interacting with, and making sure that there's a lot of interaction with different managers so they actually are integrated across the company. So it really is the more virtual one is, the more intentional every aspect has to be, and particularly onboarding.
Well, your book is all about empathy. How should we be treating these? I mean, I've never had a boss in my engineering career who was empathetic. In fact, my last one was a total sociopath, which is why I got out of technology in my mid to late 50s. How is this group of employees different from an empathy perspective?
Look, I think every single person is different, as you said earlier on. I mean, we can do some generational groupings because of how they interact with technology and where they are in their career arc. However, we do have many careers now. I'm on my second career, and therefore, so our career arcs have different shapes now. But as far as it comes to empathy for me, and the book was really about empathy and the future of work. So it is really about human-centric understanding and this environment that we're now in, which is really driven by technology. There are some societal changes as well. And the other aspect is talent. So we finally created these machines, which are very sophisticated, much more intuitive, and touch screens and all those wonderful things. Now we can use them as the sophisticated tools that we have, rather than us be having to live our lives and our govern our working lives by where the machines are, because they're sort of clunky and expensive and have to be in enormous factory boxes. So where empathy comes in is really everywhere. When we're working in teams more and projects, and when we're particularly working with much more non-routine work. So that's been growing massively over the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, actually. And so what that means when we're thinking about the younger employees, how are they going to work best? Now, I think a lot of us, Gen Xers, boomers, we don't necessarily know how we work best. I think you do, particularly if you've come out of technology, or that you can, and working in a very independent way. But particularly if you worked in a big organization and been, 9 to 5 or whatever your hours were, and it was in a fixed place and it was fixed hours and it was fixed location, you never really had to, there was no point in trying to figure out when you worked best. If you were, really not a morning person, you might have worked that one out and actually make sure you either got up earlier if it was an important meeting and had a huge thing of coffee. But otherwise, you didn't really have to work that out. Now you really do. So helping younger employees understand what their preferences are, how they work best, how you work best, and so you can, and what oversight and how you manage and how you can better manage people. Some people need a really great, only need a sort of a deadline, and they can get on with it. And other people need a lot more oversight. And then the building blocks. Now, this is the really interesting thing for me is the how of work. Now, we've never paid attention and actually sat down and designed, in most cases, unless you have sort of consultants who sort of work out optimization practices, is what the how of work is. Now, if you're a young person and you've never sat in an office and watched somebody and designed, kind of like worked out how you work best and how you could structure it best and the framework that could be helpful for you, then getting some guidance on that is going to be very, very helpful. And using project management tools and email, for example, is very clunky and it's really not very helpful. But a project management tool, whether it's Asana or a Trello or whatever that might be, plus Slack, plus whatever, trying to help them work out how to work best, and then being very clear about what it is that's needed, not dictating how it should be done, but what's needed and these are some of the ways that it can be done. And then they can pick and choose what's going to be helpful for them, because, as kids now are being taught many different strategies for math, right? Because they understand, like, it's not just going to be this particular strategy that's going to work with every kid. That's the same way to pre-approaching work and helping them find the strategy that's going to be good, rather than micromanaging those are some of there are a lot of different things that we're needing to deal with, but it's for everybody. It's not just for Gen Z, but for them when they're coming into the workforce, it's going to be most helpful for them.
What I just took out of that is, number one, we actually have to talk to them and listen to them.
I know, right?
Yeah. Well, we are just coming out of one of the most disruptive business environments we've ever had, i.e. the pandemic. We have a group of graduates that had some portion of their education disrupted. We were suddenly all locked up. Those of us who are adults, we know how to cope with that, although a lot of folks didn't cope with it well. Take a young kid who's never had this experience. They need help learning how to cope with this stuff. I know if I had been 18, 20 years old when the pandemic started, it would not have been, because, when you're, I'll put it this way, when you're an 18-year-old guy, you're really stupid. You may be intellectually smart,
right?
But in every other way, you're stupid.
Ignorant. There's a lot of learning to be done.
I have a lot of funny stories. I taught high school math for 2 years in the middle of my career.
Okay.
And so I have a lot of
okay. All right. So
but nonetheless, it is, it's a level of maturity.
Yes. And it's, in many ways, I find that they do have an extraordinary maturity comparison to where I was and what I knew and experienced and understood. And part of that is, they have a phone in their hands, which gives them access to extraordinary amounts of information. At the same time, they don't necessarily, of course, have the or the experience to synthesize that data and understand what it really means. So they do interpret, and they interpret in their own way. And, a hack is one way of interpreting. Hack is the way that my parents or my teacher or my boss said it is like way too unwieldy, doesn't really work. There must be a better way. And let's just try and find out what a better way might be. And that's a sort of nice way of saying it. So I think, looking at the hacks and sort of thinking about things differently and trying to put aside, I do find that the US is extraordinarily good at hacking business and kind of like, let's look at this differently. What can we do differently? In terms of work, that's different. So in terms of business, absolutely. But in terms of work, there's so much traditional, conventional way of we should do it like this or we must do it like that. And so I think that's where we can, having conversations and doing that listening and sort of thinking about, and that's why I think that the pandemic the disruption is helpful to look at how we did manage to thrive and in some cases really survive and in sometimes cases thrive, because we really thought out of the box and we looked and kind of said, well, what can we do if we're going to survive and we've got to, keep these people employed and keep the business going? Oh, let's ask different people for solutions and what new technologies can we deploy, and really thinking differently, not being entrenched in the ways of how people had been working. So I think keeping those learnings and really thinking about what we learned from the way that we responded, worked together, rallied. I do look at the majority of the conditions that we were dealing with over the past 30 months as being much more about the future of work than the pandemic. And the way that we can move on with those productively is incorporating a lot of those learnings. And that did really sort of encourage the younger, what was more inclusive, I think, of the younger folks, and as well being more empathetic, being more raw and vulnerable, and showing that vulnerability and asking for kind of like, well, what do you think? Because those type of things are going to create the safe spaces and going to encourage people to bring really interesting out of the box thinking, which I think is what most businesses need right now.
Yeah, there's no question we are going to go into a recession. I believe businesses are going to react to it differently, because will they do massive layoffs? I don't think so. I think they're going to find different ways of handling it, because finding good people has been so hard in this last year. And I just did a podcast on the weird dynamics of the job market right now. We still have a lot of people who are suffering from long COVID.
Right. Yes.
And we have a lot of people out of the workforce that have not come back. We're going to have to learn how to deal with this younger cohort because they are the future. And it's my belief that as with each generation that's been shaped by, different events, the pandemic being a big one, the businesses will change. The people, how we reacted to the pandemic will change. And I believe that there has to be a fundamental change in how we treat people. And I think we're seeing the fact that initially when we were coming out of the pandemic, return to the office, everyone's going to come back to the office. And the answer was from a lot of employees was, no, we're not.
No, it's been very interesting because there's been a non-collective bargaining, collective resistance. I think there are lots and lots of employees who don't want. I mean, the data appears to show that most people don't want to be working from home full time. There are people who've moved and they've moved to a different city and need to have more space, whatever it might be. But most people don't. Maybe 15% of people do. But most people want to be in the office 2-3 days a week or whatever it might be, and on a flexible basis, which, what suits them. However, so many people seem to be resisting going back into the office because they fear that they don't trust the organization to not force them back into the office permanently if they come back. And it's so interesting to feel that and to understand that this is resistance. And there are so many articles which is about sort of the power play and employees have so much power and they're going to lose their power. Just watch when the recession comes. That's not going to happen. The power is, I really don't want to even talk about power because I think it's such a negative way. It's not productive at all to be talking about it like that. For a start, I do think that the social contract, just one comment on that, the social contract has been broken in this country for years. And the job bundle that used to include job security and a lot of other kind of benefits and that whole thing. And it was about, we look after you. There's a sort of patriarchal discussion about the organization, but there was a balance, and you put up with long, crappy hours, for years at the beginning, but you did actually come out with, at the end, with some kind of, small nest egg and a better situation so that you could. That does not exist at all. And that fundamental realization, without that fundamental realization, I think it's hard to understand why somebody who's young is coming to the organization wants to, is asking for promotion very early, because they want more security. They want to be able to move out of their parents' house if they possibly can. They want to know, do you actually, if they're not told, they want to basically, certainly some of them are saying, do you see me here in the future? And without asking that question, it could be asked differently, obviously. But the reactions from HR people I know across the board are like, how dare you ask for a promotion at that, after 9 months? But if what they're really asking is, do you see a future for me here?
What I hear from you is, does the company actually care about the employee?
Absolutely.
And that is a real shift, because I graduated from college in 1978, went to work for IBM. I was assimilated. Resistance was futile. And although I was pretty rebellious.
I quote Hal in my first book, by the way.
Well, it's about being empathetic to the younger employees, because that's what they want. They want to know that you actually care, so that you want them to stay.
Right. And I think every human being does and would appreciate it. We, of course, have not been used to that. We don't necessarily need it. Absolutely. Would you appreciate it? It's a really fundamental need, because if I don't think that you care, if I come to work for your organization and I don't think you care, it's not that I'm kind of like, I need you to look after me. It's that if you don't care, you're not going to, or that's one way of expressing it, then you're not going to pay attention to how upskilled I am, how competitive I am, where my career is going. They're very practical things and you're not going to be transparent with me about where my career might be going or if there's a future for me here. If there isn't going to be a place because the company has to pivot because customer behaviors are changing, which I am aware of and alert to, and I'm not, I don't think you should keep a job for me if there's no job to be had. But you can let me know ahead of time. You can maybe talk to another company outside of this one and find a place for me, or just at least give me a heads up so that I can look for it. But the key thing is, are you going to help me stay competitive, for the business, which is good for the business and necessary for me? Again, going back to that sort of financial security, that income security, because I know that you can fire me, on a dime. So that's where the sort of the values, that's the only thing. If I don't have any job security, there's nothing else that's going to support me.
Sophie, I think that's a good positive note to finish on. Well, it really comes down to is they have walked into a period of insecurity.
They have. And I think there's a lot of stuff that we can do to be all working together. I think they have a lot to contribute. I think there are a lot of amazing ideas. And we're going to, part of it is we created this period of insecurity. And so there's no blame. It's a question of these are the realities. And the more that we can all be supportive of each other, the better off we'll all be. And I do see that we're going to a better place. I really do. But it's just going to be very messy on the way.
So, Sophie, if someone wanted to reach out and contact you, buy your book, how might they do that?
Empathy Works is my book. Empathy Works, the key to competitive advantage in the new era of work. It's available on Amazon, all online retailers, and in bookstores. SophieWade.com is an easy way to reach me. My company is Flex Network. I also have my own podcast called Transforming Work, which has a lot of interesting people who are doing very different things and succeeding in trying out, experimenting with, and implementing new ways of working, new ways of thinking, new mindsets, all that kind of thing, which I've is purposely done to be helpful as we go through this very messy time. So, but please reach out to me also on LinkedIn. We're going through a difficult time or interesting and challenging time, as I love change. But please reach out to me. I'd be delighted to speak with you.
And we will put links to all of that in the show notes.
Thank you, Mark.
So with that, thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
It's been such a delight to be here. Thank you so much, Mark.
I hope you found our discussion useful. We live in uncertain times, and I want you to empathize with this latest cohort. Think about if you had entered the workforce in times like we have now. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. I recently published my latest white paper, Ageism, The Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-295. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.